Commander Marcus Vale was about to make the biggest mistake of his 20-year military career, messing with a woman soldier without knowing she was a Navy SEAL. Naval Station Pensacola, Florida. The training facility reeked of determination, sweat, and barely contained aggression. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Combat boots thundered across polished concrete as dozens of naval personnel crowded around the sparring mats, their voices a low rumble of anticipation. In the center of it all, Vale prowled like a shark sensing blood in the water, his chest puffed with the kind of arrogance that comes from never being truly tested. He had targeted what he assumed was just another desk sailor, completely unaware that standing before him was one of the most lethal warriors the Navy had ever produced. What happened next would shatter his world and teach everyone in that room a lesson about respect that would echo through the halls of Pensacola for years to come. Across from him stood Petty Officer First Class Aleta Rodriguez, early 30s, compact and composed. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, revealing a face marked by focus and an almost unsettling calm. A thin white scar traced from her left temple to her jawline, not fresh but permanent, like a signature written in flesh. She stood motionless, hands relaxed at her sides, breathing steady despite the electric tension crackling through the room. Vale's voice boomed across the facility, carrying the kind of theatrical confidence that always preceded a fall. "Today, we're going to demonstrate the reality of combat," he announced, scanning the crowd like a politician working a rally. "No choreographed moves, no pulling punches. Real resistance, real consequences." His eyes locked onto Elena, and something predatory flickered behind his smile. Some people think military standards should be adjusted for certain personnel. The pause was deliberate, loaded with implication. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd. Elena's expression never changed. She simply breathed, in out in, like a metronome, keeping time with something the rest of them couldn't hear. "Physical requirements exist for a reason," Vale continued, beginning to circle her slowly. "When bullets start flying, biology doesn't care about your feelings. Mass matters. Strength matters. Reality matters." The crowd shifted, sensing this was less about training and more about proving a point. Elena tracked his movement with her eyes, never turning her head, never adjusting her stance. She looked like someone waiting for a bus rather than someone about to be humiliated in front of 50 witnesses. Vale stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel his breath when he spoke. "Petty Officer Rodriguez here represents the new Navy," he said, voice dripping with mockery. "All theory, no practical application. Clean uniforms, clean records, clean hands." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Bet she's never even been in a real fight." The silence that followed felt dangerous, like the moment before lightning strikes. Elena's calm never wavered. Her voice, when it came, was steady and professional. "Permission to speak, sir." "Granted." Vale smirked, clearly expecting either an argument or an excuse. "Are we training or performing, sir?" The question hung in the air like a challenge wrapped in perfect military courtesy. A few sharp intakes of breath cut through the quiet. Vale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd expected submission, not precision. "We're demonstrating reality," he said, his tone sharpening. "Something you apparently need to learn." Without warning, without technique, without honor, he drew back and struck her across the jaw with his open palm. The crack of skin meeting skin echoed through the facility like a gunshot. For exactly 2 seconds, the world held its breath. Elena's head moved with the impact, a controlled turn that absorbed the force rather than fighting it. Then she came back to center, calm as still water, and looked at him with eyes that held depths no one in that room had imagined possible. No anger, no shock, no fear. Just assessment, What happened next occurred so fast that most witnesses would spend years trying to explain it. Elena moved like water finding its level, one fluid motion that turned Vale's aggression into his own downfall. Her left hand caught his extended wrist, her right hand guided his elbow, and her hip became the fulcrum that sent all his weight exactly where she wanted it. Vale hit the mat with a sound like a tree falling, the breath driven from his lungs in a harsh wheeze that silenced every voice in the room. Elena stood over him, not triumphant, not angry, just present. Her voice remained level, professional, almost gentle. "Sir, I recommend you stay down until you can breathe properly." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of absolute stillness that arrives when everyone realizes they've witnessed something that will change everything they thought they knew. Before we continue this story of hidden strength and earned respect, make sure to subscribe to Heroes Untold so you never miss these incredible tales of courage under fire. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Because what you're about to discover about Petty Officer Elena Rodriguez will change everything you think you know about strength, respect, and the deadly mistake of underestimating the quiet ones. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Across from him stood Petty Officer First Class Elena Rodriguez, early 30s, compact and composed. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, revealing a face marked by focus and an almost unsettling calm. A thin white scar traced from her left temple to her jawline, not fresh but permanent, like a signature written in flesh. She stood motionless, hands relaxed at her sides, breathing steady despite the electric tension crackling through the room. Elena had arrived at Naval Station Pensacola 3 weeks earlier with transfer orders that said administrative rotation. The kind of vague military paperwork that raises eyebrows but discourages questions. Her personnel file was surprisingly thin for someone with 12 years of service. Clean record, exemplary marks, but strangely few details about her previous assignments. The kind of gaps that either meant someone had screwed up the paperwork, or someone very important wanted those gaps to exist. She unpacked her gear with methodical precision, set her rack to inspection standards, and by 0500 the next morning was already in the training facility running drills before anyone else arrived. At 32, she was older than most of the sailors around her, though her compact frame and quiet demeanor made her easy to overlook in a crowd of loud, competitive personalities. There was something about her presence that unsettled people who were used to noise and bravado. She never raised her voice, never joined the usual military banter, and never shared sea stories from her previous duty stations. When others complained about training schedules or base food, she just listened with the patient attention of someone who'd heard much worse complaints in much worse places. The scar caught fluorescent light whenever she turned her head, drawing glances and whispered speculation. Some said it looked like shrapnel damage. Others thought it might be from a training accident. The braver souls who asked about it directly received the same response every time: old news, sailor. Focus on your form. Elena moved through the facility like she owned invisible blueprints of every room, every exit, every blind spot. Her situational awareness was constant but subtle, eyes that tracked movement without staring, posture that suggested relaxation while maintaining perfect balance. She had the peculiar ability to fade into the background during group activities while somehow remaining the most alert person in any room. During physical training, she never tried to outshine anyone. When a sailor struggled with a technique, she'd offer quiet corrections with surgical precision. When arguments broke out over proper procedure, she'd diffuse tension with a single look and a few well-chosen words that somehow made everyone remember they were professionals. But it was her breathing that really set her apart. Deep, controlled, rhythmic, even under stress, even when being screamed at by instructors. even when facing the kind of physical challenges that left others gasping and shaking. She breathed like someone who'd learned to control her autonomic nervous system through circumstances most people couldn't imagine. At night, when other sailors hit the rec room or caught up on social media, Elena stayed in the training facility. The lights dimmed, the mats empty except for the sound of her controlled movements and soft landings. She practiced sequences that weren't in any manual, complex flows that suggested muscle memory built in places where mistakes meant more than losing points. Her gear told its own story to those who knew what to look for. Boots worn smooth in patterns that came from rappelling and water operations. A watch with tide tables and luminous markers designed for night navigation. Gloves with reinforced palms that spoke of rope work and fast roping from helicopters. The whispers started within days of her arrival. "She's too calm for admin duty. Nobody moves like that from pushing papers. Have you seen how she strips and cleans her sidearm? That's not quarterly qualification technique." Elena heard the speculation but never acknowledged it. She maintained her quiet routine, helped struggling sailors improve their performance, and kept her own counsel. When directly asked about her background, she'd deflect with questions about the sailors' own training goals or career plans. Commander Vale noticed her from the beginning, and her refusal to play his dominance games grated against his ego like sandpaper. In his world, respect was demanded, not earned. Sailors who didn't react to his authority felt like personal affronts, especially one who carried herself like she'd seen command structures that operated by entirely different rules. But Elena Rodriguez wasn't trying to challenge anyone. She was simply existing in the careful, controlled way that had kept her alive through deployments and operations that didn't officially exist. She had no interest in proving anything to anyone. She had no idea that her very presence was about to teach everyone in that facility what real strength looked like. Vale's voice boomed across the facility, carrying the kind of theatrical confidence that always preceded a fall. "Today, we're going to demonstrate the reality of combat," he announced, scanning the crowd like a politician working a rally. "No choreographed moves. No pulling punches. Real resistance, real consequences." His eyes locked onto Elena, and something predatory flickered behind his smile. The kind of look that said he'd been waiting for this moment, planning it, savoring the anticipation of what he thought would be an easy victory. The sailors around the mat shifted uncomfortably, sensing that what was about to happen had little to do with training and everything to do with ego. "Some people think military standards should be adjusted for certain personnel," Vale continued, his voice carrying across the facility with deliberate emphasis on each word. The pause was loaded with implication, heavy with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from someone who's never been held accountable for their words. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd from sailors who weren't sure whether they were supposed to laugh or cringe. Elena's expression never changed. She simply breathed out in like a metronome, keeping time with something the rest of them couldn't hear. Her hands remained relaxed at her sides, her posture perfectly balanced, as if Vale's words were just background noise that didn't merit a response. "Physical requirements exist for a reason," Vale continued, beginning to circle her slowly like a predator sizing up prey. "When bullets start flying, biology doesn't care about your feelings. Mass matters. Strength matters. Reality matters." Each word was delivered with increasing volume, as if volume alone could make his point more valid. The crowd shifted, sensing this was less about training and more about something darker. Several senior petty officers exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable to openly disapproving. But Vale outranked them all, and challenging a commander's training methods in front of junior sailors was a career-limiting move. Elena tracked his movement with her eyes, never turning her head, never adjusting her stance. She looked like someone waiting for a bus rather than someone about to be humiliated in front of 50 witnesses. Her breathing remained steady, controlled, as if she'd done this dance before in circumstances far more dangerous than a training facility filled with witnesses. Modern warfare requires adaptability, Vale said, his voice taking on a lecturing tone that suggested he believed his own propaganda. But it also requires acknowledging limitations. Some of us are built for certain roles. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell his aftershave mixed with the sharp scent of his sweat. And some of us aren't. The silence that followed felt dangerous, like the moment before lightning strikes. Even the most junior sailors recognized that something had shifted, that they were witnessing something that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with a powerful man's need to diminish, someone who threatened his sense of superiority. Elena's voice, when it came, cut through the tension like a blade. "Permission to speak, sir." The words were delivered with perfect military courtesy. But there was something underneath them, not defiance, not fear. Just a calm professionalism that somehow made Vale's theatrics look petty and small. "Granted," Vale smirked, clearly expecting either an argument he could demolish or an excuse he could mock. "Are we training or performing, sir?" The question hung in the air like a challenge wrapped in perfect military etiquette. A few sharp intakes of breath cut through the quiet as sailors realized they'd just witnessed a verbal precision strike delivered with surgical accuracy. The question didn't challenge Vale's authority directly, but it exposed the gap between what he claimed to be doing and what everyone could see he was actually doing. Vale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His carefully constructed narrative had just been dissected by 6 simple words delivered without emotion, without heat, without anything he could point to as insubordination. He'd expected submission, gotten precision instead. And the difference threw him off his carefully rehearsed script. "We're demonstrating reality," he said, his tone sharpening as he tried to regain control of the moment. "Something you apparently need to learn." The words came out harder than he'd intended, betraying the frustration of a man who just realized his opponent was playing a different game entirely. The facility fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of aircraft operations outside. 50 pairs of eyes watched as Commander Marcus Vale drew back his right hand, fingers spread, and prepared to make the mistake that would define the rest of his career. Elena saw it coming. The telegraph in his shoulders, the shift in his weight, the slight widening of his stance. She could have moved, could have stepped back, could have deflected. Instead, she stood perfectly still and let him commit to the action that would reveal exactly who both of them really were. The slap came hard and fast, delivered with all the force of a man trying to prove his dominance through violence. The crack of skin meeting skin echoed through the facility like a gunshot, sharp and final and completely unforgivable. For exactly 2 seconds, the world held its breath. 50 witnesses tried to process what they'd just seen. A commanding officer had just struck a subordinate in front of half the base, crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed, making a choice that would echo through both of their lives forever. Elena's head moved with the impact, a controlled turn that absorbed the force rather than fighting it. Then she came back to center, calm as still water, and looked at him with eyes that held depths no one in that room had imagined possible. No anger, no shock, no fear, just assessment. And in that moment of perfect stillness, everyone present realized they were about to witness something extraordinary. What happened next occurred so fast that most witnesses would spend years trying to explain it. Elena moved like water finding its level, one fluid motion that turned Vale's aggression into his own downfall. Her left hand caught his extended wrist, her right hand guided his elbow, and her hip became the fulcrum that sent all his weight exactly where she wanted it. Vale hit the mat with a sound like a tree falling, the breath driven from his lungs in a harsh wheeze that silenced every voice in the room. He lay there, staring at the ceiling tiles, his mind struggling to process how he'd gone from standing upright to flat on his back in less time than it took to blink. Elena stood over him. Not triumphant, not angry, just present. Her voice remained level, professional, almost gentle. "Sir, I recommend you stay down until you can breathe properly." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of absolute stillness that arrives when everyone realizes they've witnessed something that will change everything they thought they knew. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked. A watch beeped the hour. The sound somehow obscene in the cathedral quiet of the training facility. Vale struggled to his feet, his face cycling through shades of red and purple as he fought to regain both his breath and his dignity. His uniform was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. But worse than the physical embarrassment was the look in his eyes, the dawning recognition that he'd just been handled by someone operating on a completely different level. Again, he wheezed, trying to inject authority into a voice that came out thin and strained. That was luck. Elena reset her stance without comment, hands returning to her sides, breathing unchanged. She looked at him with the patient attention of someone waiting for him to make his next mistake. Vale circled again, this time more cautiously, but his ego wouldn't let him back down in front of 50 witnesses. He feinted left, then lunged right, trying to tackle her at the waist. Elena's response was economical and devastating. A slight pivot, a hand placed precisely at his shoulder, and Vale found himself guided face first into the mat with all the ceremony of someone taking out the trash. "Sir," Elena said calmly as Vale pushed himself up on his hands and knees, spitting and blinking away the spots dancing across his vision. "This doesn't have to continue." But it did continue, because men like Marcus Vale couldn't accept the reality of their limitations. 3 more times he came at her, and 3 more times he found himself on the mat. Each landing harder than the last, each technique more precise than necessary. Each moment of control lasting just long enough to drive home the point that Elena could have hurt him badly if she'd chosen to dot by the 5th takedown. Several sailors were exchanging glances that spoke volumes, the kind of looks that said they were witnessing something unprecedented. Elena wasn't just defending herself, she was conducting a masterclass in controlled violence, demonstrating the difference between aggression and skill, between bullying and actual combat proficiency. Vale stayed down longer after the 5th fall, his chest heaving, sweat staining his uniform. When he finally looked up at Elena, something had changed in his expression. The arrogance was still there, but it was now mixed with something else, a growing awareness that he might have made a terrible miscalculation. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena's answer was perfectly regulation and completely unsatisfying. "Various training programs, sir." The evasion only deepened the mystery. Sailors who'd been watching began to murmur among themselves, their voices low but urgent. Elena's movements hadn't been standard Navy combatives. They'd been something else entirely, fluid, precise, and utterly without wasted motion. The kind of technique that spoke of training far beyond what most personnel ever received. Senior Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, watching from the edge of the crowd, felt something click in her memory. She'd seen movement like that before, years ago, during a brief assignment at a classified facility in Virginia. The kind of place where personnel didn't wear name tags and questions about backgrounds were politely but firmly discouraged. "Attention on deck!" Santos called suddenly, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. The room snapped to attention as a figure appeared in the doorway. Captain James Morrison, the base commanding officer. Drawn by reports of an unusual training session that had gotten out of hand, Morrison's eyes swept the scene, taking in Vale's disheveled appearance, Elena's perfect composure, and the electric tension crackling through the assembled sailors. His expression revealed nothing, but those who knew him recognized the slight tightening around his eyes, that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "Commander Vale," Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the room want to stand straighter. "Report." Vale struggled to his feet, attempting to salvage what remained of his dignity. "Sir, conducting combatives training. Demonstrating the importance of realistic expectations in combat scenarios." Morrison's gaze shifted to Elena, who stood at perfect attention. "Petty Officer Rodriguez, your assessment of this training exercise." Elena's response was a masterpiece of military diplomacy. "Sir, the commander provided valuable instruction on the importance of maintaining situational awareness and not underestimating one's opponent." A ghost of a smile flickered across Morrison's face. He'd been in the Navy long enough to recognize a perfectly constructed non-answer when he heard one. He also had clearance high enough to access personnel files that told stories most people weren't authorized to read. "Carry on," he said simply. But his eyes lingered on Elena for a moment longer than regulation required. As he turned to leave, he paused. "Commander Vale, a word in my office when you're finished here." The door closed behind the captain with a soft click that somehow sounded like a gavel falling. Vale stood in the center of the mat, surrounded by witnesses to his humiliation, finally beginning to understand that he might have just made an enemy of someone far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Elena remained at attention until Vale dismissed the formation, her expression revealing nothing of the thoughts racing behind her calm exterior. As the sailors began to disperse, she heard the whispers starting, speculation about her background, her training, her true identity. The questions were beginning, and Elena knew that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to become much more difficult to preserve. Elena Rodriguez had arrived at Naval Station Pensacola 6 weeks earlier with transfer orders that raised more questions than they answered. Her personnel jacket was remarkably thin for someone with over a decade of service, clean fitness reports, exemplary conduct marks, but a conspicuous absence of detailed assignment histories. The kind of file that either indicated sloppy record-keeping or deliberate obfuscation. She'd been assigned to the Naval Education and Training Command as a training coordination specialist, a position vague enough to encompass everything and nothing. Her supervisor, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, had expected to receive another burnt-out sailor looking for an easy rotation before retirement. Instead, she got Elena Rodriguez. Elena approached her new assignment with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. She arrived early, stayed late, and transformed the chaotic training schedules into models of efficiency. Her suggestions for improving physical training protocols were subtle but revolutionary, incorporating techniques that seemed to come from a much deeper well of experience than her official record indicated. But it was her off-duty behavior that really set her apart. While other sailors hit the beach, caught movies, or pursued the usual recreational activities, Elena maintained a routine that spoke of different priorities entirely. Every morning at 0430, before the base officially came alive, she could be found in the gymnasium running through exercises that weren't in any manual. Her movements were fluid, precise, and utterly without wasted motion. She practiced sequences that looked like a deadly dance, transitions, from striking to grappling to ground control, that suggested training in multiple martial arts disciplines. But more telling than the techniques themselves was the way she practiced them, with the focused intensity of someone maintaining skills that might someday mean the difference between life and death. Chief Petty Officer Miguel Torres had been working late one evening when he'd stumbled across Elena in the darkened gymnasium. She was working through what looked like close-quarters combat scenarios, moving against imaginary opponents with startling realism. Her breathing was controlled, her movements economical, and her eyes held the kind of focused alertness that came from training in environments where mistakes had permanent consequences. Evening. Rodriguez, Torres had called out, expecting her to startle or look embarrassed at being caught. Instead, she'd simply nodded acknowledgement and continued her routine as if his presence changed nothing. "Interesting workout," Torres had commented, recognizing elements of Krav Maga Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and other systems mixed into a seamless whole. Elena's response had been characteristically minimal. "Staying sharp, Chief. For what?" He'd pressed, but Elena had already moved on to cooling down stretches, effectively ending the conversation without rudeness. That interaction had started the whispers. Torres mentioned it to a few trusted colleagues, who began paying closer attention to their newest arrival. They noticed things, the way Elena's eyes constantly tracked exits and potential threats, even during casual conversations. How she positioned herself in rooms to maintain lines of sight and escape routes. The unconscious way she tested the weight and balance of any tool or implement she picked up. Her gear told its own story to those trained to read such signs. Her boots showed wear patterns consistent with fast roping and maritime operations. Her personal knife, glimpsed during equipment maintenance, was a specialized combat blade with a non-reflective coating. Her watch featured tide tables, magnetic compass, and other features unnecessary for administrative duties, but perhaps most telling was her reaction to unexpected noises. When a truck backfired in the parking lot during the meeting, most personnel jumped or looked around curiously. Elena had immediately identified the direction of the sound, assessed potential threats, and positioned herself between the noise and the nearest exit, all while appearing to remain focused on the briefing materials in front of her. Commander Vale had noticed Elena almost immediately upon her arrival, but not for the reasons that impressed others. To him, her quiet competence felt like a challenge to his authority. Her refusal to participate in the usual military social dynamics, the casual hazing of newcomers, the competitive banter, the implicit acknowledgement of unofficial hierarchies, struck him as insubordination disguised as professionalism. Vale thrived on the kind of respect that came from intimidation. His leadership style depended on maintaining clear dominance through verbal aggression and physical posturing. Elena's complete immunity to these tactics left him feeling off balance and increasingly hostile. He'd started with small provocations, assigning her additional duties, questioning her methods during meetings, making pointed comments about personnel who thought they were too good for standard procedures. Elena had responded to each escalation with perfect military courtesy and flawless performance, making it impossible for Vale to find legitimate grounds for disciplinary action. The situation had been building for weeks before the training incident. Vale's frustration with Elena's unshakable composure had grown into something approaching obsession. He'd begun looking for opportunities to publicly demonstrate his authority over her, to force her into a position where she'd have to acknowledge his dominance. The combatives training session had seemed like the perfect venue. Physical confrontation in a controlled environment, surrounded by witnesses who would see him reassert the natural order he believed in. He'd planned it carefully, building up to the moment when he could demonstrate that all Elena's quiet confidence meant nothing against superior size and strength. What Vale hadn't considered was the possibility that Elena's confidence might be based on something more substantial than attitude, that her calm might come from experience rather than ignorance, that her refusal to be intimidated might reflect not naivety, but the perspective of someone who'd faced much worse threats than a blustering commander with delusions of competence. As the crowd dispersed after Captain Morrison's arrival, Elena maintained her position until formally dismissed, but she was acutely aware of the changed dynamic in the room. The careful anonymity she'd maintained since her arrival was beginning to crack. Questions were being asked, and some of the people asking them had the clearance and connections to find answers. She'd known this moment would come eventually. It always did. The whispers started within hours of the training incident. spreading through Naval Station Pensacola like wildfire through dry brush. In the mess hall, sailors leaned across tables to share what they'd witnessed. In the barracks, hushed conversations continued long after lights out. The story grew with each telling. But the core remained consistent. Elena Rodriguez was not who she appeared to be. Petty officer. Second-class David Kim had been close enough to see the precise mechanics of Elena's takedowns. He'd wrestled in college, knew enough about leverage and timing to recognize that what he'd witnessed went far beyond standard Navy combatives training. Over lunch, he found himself surrounded by eager listeners as he tried to explain the technical aspects of what Elena had done. It wasn't just that she took him down, Kim explained, gesturing with his fork. It was how controlled it was. She could have hurt him badly, broken his arm, dislocated his shoulder, whatever. But she didn't. Every single movement was calibrated to neutralize without permanent damage. Seaman apprentice Lisa Chun, fresh out of boot camp and still wide-eyed about military life, asked the question everyone was thinking: where do you learn stuff like that? Kim exchanged glances with several of the more experienced sailors at the table. They all knew the answer, even if none of them wanted to say it out loud. That level of skill didn't come from weekend warrior training or even advanced Navy schools. It came from places where such techniques were matters of survival rather than sport. In the adjacent building, Senior Chief Maria Santos was having a very different conversation with her fellow senior enlisted personnel. Santos had 23 years in the Navy, had served in locations that didn't appear on most maps, and had worked alongside personnel whose backgrounds were need-to-know classified. "I've seen her file," Santos said quietly. Her voice pitched low enough that only her immediate circle could hear. Or rather, I've seen what passes for her file. 12 years of service, and most of it's redacted or listed as special assignment duty. That's not normal rotation paperwork. Chief Petty Officer Robert Martinez nodded grimly. He'd noticed the same anomalies when Elena's transfer had come through his office. Her security clearance level doesn't match her supposed job description either. You don't need TSSI access to coordinate training schedules. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. They'd all served long enough to recognize the bureaucratic fingerprints of special operations assignments. The careful gaps in service records, the vague duty descriptions, the security clearances that exceeded apparent job requirements, all telltale signs of someone whose real work happened in shadows. Meanwhile, in another part of the base, a more detailed investigation was already underway. Captain Morrison had returned to his office after witnessing the training incident. But instead of immediately summoning Commander Vale for the promised discussion, he'd placed a secure call to Naval Special Warfare Command. The conversation had been brief and cryptic, consisting mainly of service numbers, clearance codes, and carefully worded questions about personnel assignments. But the response had confirmed Morrison's growing suspicions about his newest arrival. Elena Rodriguez was indeed not who she appeared to be, at least not entirely. Her official assignment to Naval Station Pensacola was legitimate, but it was also what the intelligence community called a soft cover position. She was there for reasons that had nothing to do with training coordination and everything to do with recovering from an assignment that had gone catastrophically wrong. Morrison pulled Elena's real file from the secure server, his clearance level finally high enough to access the full picture. What he read made him understand why Commander Vale's aggressive behavior had been such a colossal mistake in judgment. Elena Rodriguez had spent the last 5 years assigned to Naval Special Warfare Development Group, more commonly known as SEAL Team 6. Her specialized training included advanced close-quarters combat, maritime operations, and what the file euphemistically described as direct action missions in support of national security objectives. Her most recent assignment had been a classified operation in the Persian Gulf that had gone sideways. when their target turned out to be better defended than intelligence had indicated. 3 team members had been killed in the ensuing firefight. Elena had single-handedly held off superior forces for 47 minutes while coordinating the evacuation of wounded teammates and critical intelligence materials. She'd been awarded a Navy Cross for her actions, though the citation itself was classified and would never appear in any public record. The scar on her face was a souvenir from that night. Shrapnel from an improvised explosive device that had detonated close enough to temporarily blind her in one eye while she provided covering fire for the extraction. Her assignment to Pensacola was officially designated as administrative rotation pending psychological evaluation and career reassignment consideration. In plain English, the Navy was giving her time to decompress from the kind of trauma that broke some of their best operators, while deciding whether she was fit to return to active special operations duty. Morrison closed the file and sat back in his chair, processing the implications. Elena Rodriguez wasn't just a decorated special operator. She was someone who'd proven herself under the worst possible circumstances. And Commander Vale, in his ignorant arrogance, had chosen to physically assault her in front of 50 witnesses. The irony wasn't lost on Morrison. Vale had tried to humiliate someone he viewed as weak, only to discover he'd picked a fight with one of the most dangerous individuals currently stationed on his base. Elena's restraint during the incident hadn't been born of submission or fear. It had been the calculated response of someone trained to use minimal necessary force to neutralize threats. But Morrison's immediate concern wasn't the military justice implications of Vale's actions, serious though they were. His worry was operational security. Elena's presence at Pensacola was supposed to be unremarkable, a quiet rotation that would allow her to heal away from the high-stress environment of special operations. Vale's public confrontation had shattered that anonymity. By evening, speculation about Elena's background had moved beyond casual gossip. Sailors with friends in other commands were making phone calls, trying to verify rumors. Computer-savvy personnel were attempting to access databases that might contain more detailed service records. The carefully constructed cover story that had protected Elena's true assignment was beginning to unravel. Elena herself was fully aware of the growing attention. Years of operational experience had taught her to read the subtle signs of blown cover, the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, the increased scrutiny from senior personnel, the carefully casual questions about her background from people who normally ignored her existence. She'd expected this moment to come eventually. It always did when operators tried to transition back to conventional military life. The skills that kept them alive in combat situations were too distinctive to hide indefinitely. Sooner or later, someone always noticed the discrepancies between official cover stories and observable capabilities. What she hadn't anticipated was that the revelation would come through such a public and dramatic confrontation. The incident with Commander Vale had forced her to demonstrate abilities that were supposed to remain hidden, turning what should have been a quiet recovery assignment into a potential intelligence nightmare. As she sat in her quarters that evening, cleaning and maintaining equipment that most administrative personnel would never need, Elena considered her options. She could request an immediate transfer, disappearing into another assignment before the speculation grew too serious. She could maintain her cover story and hope the interest would fade. Or she could accept that her anonymity was already compromised and prepare for the consequences. Outside her window, the sun set over Pensacola Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. In a few hours, Captain Morrison would be making another secure call to Naval Special Warfare Command, and Elena's carefully planned recovery period would officially come to an end. The only question remaining was whether Commander Vale would realize the magnitude of his mistake before it was too late to contain the damage. He'd already caused. The breaking point came 2 days later. During what was supposed to be a routine training exercise, Commander Vale had convinced himself that the previous incident was a fluke, a combination of luck, surprise, and his own momentary lack of focus. His ego simply couldn't accept that. He'd been systematically outclassed by someone he viewed as fundamentally inferior. Vale had spent the intervening 48 hours nursing his wounded pride and constructing elaborate justifications for what had happened. He told himself that Elena had caught him off guard, that he'd been holding back out of gentlemanly restraint, that a real confrontation would yield very different results. The whispers and speculative glances from junior personnel only fueled his determination to reassert his dominance. The opportunity came during an integrated combat scenarios training session, a grandiose name for what amounted to controlled sparring matches designed to test sailors' ability to apply their combatives training under stress. Vale had volunteered to oversee the exercise personally, ostensibly to ensure proper safety protocols, but actually to engineer another confrontation with Elena. The training bay was packed again, though this time the atmosphere was different. Word of the previous incident had spread, and sailors arrived with the anticipatory tension of spectators expecting a rematch. Elena sensed the changed dynamic immediately. The way conversation stopped when she entered, the carefully casual positioning of personnel to ensure optimal viewing angles, the electric undercurrent of expectation. Vale wasted no time in maneuvering toward his desired outcome. He paired sailors for sparring matches with obvious mismatches in size and experience, all while delivering a running commentary about the importance of realistic expectations and understanding your limitations. His words carried the subtle venom of someone building toward a larger point. Combat doesn't respect your feelings, Vale announced to the assembled group, his voice carrying the false authority of someone who'd never actually been in combat. Size matters. Strength matters. Training matters. But most importantly, experience matters. His eyes found Elena in the crowd, and his smile carried the predatory satisfaction of someone who believed he was about to even the score. "Petty Officer Rodriguez," he called out, his tone carrying mock formality. "Since you demonstrated such innovative techniques the other day, perhaps you'd be willing to help me illustrate some advanced concepts." Elena stepped forward without hesitation, her expression revealing nothing. But those who'd served with her long enough to read her subtle tells noticed the almost imperceptible shift in her stance, the way her breathing deepened slightly, the minute adjustments in how she positioned herself relative to the exits and potential threats in the room. "Sir," she acknowledged with perfect military courtesy. Vale's plan was more elaborate this time. Instead of the crude aggression that had backfired so spectacularly, he intended to use his supposed superior knowledge of combatives techniques to systematically break down Elena's defenses. He'd demonstrate throws, holds, and strikes with increasing intensity, building toward the moment when her composure would finally crack. "Today we'll explore the reality of multiple attack vectors," Vale announced to his audience. "Rodriguez will defend against increasingly complex scenarios while I provide real-time analysis of technique and tactical decision-making." The setup was designed to put Elena in a purely reactive position while allowing Vale to maintain the initiative and control the narrative. The first exchange began simply enough, a basic wrist grab that Elena neutralized with textbook efficiency. Vale nodded approvingly, playing the role of instructor while privately noting the economy of her movement. The second scenario involved a more complex grab and attempt to control her balance. Again, Elena's response was immediate and effective, but Vale pressed forward without acknowledging her success. "Notice how she relies on redirection rather than direct force," Vale commented to the crowd, his tone carrying subtle condescension. This works against cooperative training partners. But real combat presents different challenges. As he spoke, his own movements became more aggressive, more insistent, testing Elena's responses with increasing pressure. The third scenario was where Vale's true intentions became clear. Instead of the announced training drill, he launched into a combination attack designed to overwhelm Elena's defenses, multiple strikes followed by an attempt to take her to the ground. But Elena had been reading his intentions for several minutes, recognizing the escalating pattern and preparing her response accordingly. What followed was a masterclass in controlled violence that left no doubt about the vast gulf in their respective skill levels. Elena didn't just neutralize Vale's attack, she systematically dismantled it, countering each element of his combination with precision that spoke of training far beyond anything Vale had ever encountered. The sequence lasted perhaps 15 seconds. But those seconds contained enough technical excellence to rewrite everyone's understanding of what they'd witnessed 2 days earlier. Elena redirected Vale's initial strikes, used his momentum against him to break his balance, and then applied a joint lock that left him completely immobilized on the ground. His arm hyperextended just short of the point where permanent damage would occur. The silence that followed was different from before, deeper, more profound, charged with the recognition that they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. Elena held the position for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to demonstrate complete control, not long enough to cause injury, before releasing Vale and stepping back to her original position. Vale lay on the mat, gasping and disoriented, his carefully constructed plan having collapsed into humiliating failure. But this time, the humiliation was witnessed by more than just the sailors in the room. Unknown to the participants, Captain Morrison had been observing from the elevated viewing area, accompanied by 2 individuals, whose presence on the base was not part of any official schedule. The men with Morrison wore civilian clothes but carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of military professionals. Their observation of the training session had been clinical, professional, and highly focused on Elena's performance. As the exercise concluded and the sailors began to disperse, one of them leaned close to Morrison and spoke in tones too low for anyone else to hear. "That's her," he confirmed, though his words carried implications that went far beyond simple identification. "The real question is whether she's ready to come back, or if she needs more time." Morrison nodded grimly, understanding that Elena's carefully protected recovery period was officially over. The demonstration of her capabilities had been too public, too dramatic, and witnessed by too many people to maintain the fiction of her administrative assignment any longer. As Elena helped Commander Vale to his feet with the same professional courtesy she'd shown throughout the encounter, she was acutely aware that everything had changed. The careful anonymity that had protected her for weeks was gone, burned away by Vale's stubborn refusal to accept his limitations. The consequences of that loss would become clear soon enough. But for now, Elena maintained her composure, accepted Vale's grudging dismissal of the formation, and prepared herself for the reckoning she knew was coming. In the elevated viewing area, the 3 senior officers watched her walk away with the fluid, alert movement of someone trained to survive in the world's most dangerous places. The conversation that followed would determine not just Elena's immediate future, but the fate of one of the Navy's most valuable and damaged assets. Commander Vale, meanwhile, stood alone on the mat, finally beginning to understand that he'd made an enemy of someone far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined possible. Aftermath of the second confrontation brought immediate and dramatic changes to Naval Station Pensacola. Within 6 hours of the training incident, Elena found herself summoned to Captain Morrison's office, not for a routine debriefing, but for a conversation that would officially end her attempts at maintaining anonymity. Morrison's office felt different when she arrived. The usual administrative atmosphere had been replaced by something more serious, more charged with implications. Two men in civilian suits sat in chairs arranged to face Morrison's desk. Their posture and bearing immediately recognizable to Elena as fellow operators despite their business attire. "Petty Officer Rodriguez," Morrison began, his tone formal but not unfriendly. "I'd like you to meet Commander Thompson and Master Chief Kowalski from Naval Special Warfare Command." The introductions were unnecessary. Elena had worked with both men during her previous assignments. Though seeing them here meant her cover was completely blown. Thompson, a lean man in his 40s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in harsh environments, spoke first. "Elena, we need to discuss your current assignment and some recent developments that have complicated your recovery timeline." The use of her first name was significant. In the hyper-formal world of military protocol, the casual address signaled that this conversation was happening outside normal command structures. Elena remained at attention, but her mind was already processing the implications of their presence. "At ease," Morrison instructed. "This is going to be a frank discussion about your background, your current situation, and some decisions that need to be made about your future." Elena relaxed her stance but remained alert. Years of operational experience had taught her to recognize when seemingly routine conversations carried life-changing implications. The presence of her former command structure at what was supposed to be a quiet administrative assignment meant something had gone seriously wrong with her recovery plan. Kowalski, a barrel-chested man whose scarred hands spoke of decades in special operations, pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what Elena recognized as her real service record. "Your cover held for exactly 43 days, he said without preamble. "That's actually better than we expected, given the circumstances of your assignment here." The circumstances. He referred to were Elena's struggle with what military psychologists euphemistically called adjustment challenges following her last mission. 3 months earlier, Elena had been pulled from active duty after showing signs of post-traumatic stress severe enough to compromise her operational effectiveness. The assignment to Pensacola was supposed to give her time to heal while keeping her connected to military structure. The incident 2 days ago with Commander Vale was witnessed by 17 personnel. Thompson continued, reading from his own notes. "By yesterday morning, speculation about your background had reached levels that threatened operational security. By this morning, we had 3 separate requests from other commands asking about your real assignment here." Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "Elena, your presence here was supposed to be unremarkable. A quiet administrative rotation that would let you recover without drawing attention. Commander Vale's behavior has made that impossible." Elena had known this moment would come eventually. The skills that made special operators effective in combat situations also made them conspicuous in conventional military environments. The hypervigilance, the controlled movements, the automatic threat assessment, all of it marked her as someone who'd operated in worlds most military personnel never saw. "Sir," Elena said, her voice steady despite the implications of what she was hearing. "What are my options?" Kowalski answered bluntly. "You can request immediate transfer to another assignment where your background won't be an issue. You can return to active special operations duty if our medical team clears you. Or you can remain here and accept that your cover is blown, which means dealing with the security implications of having your real background known by conventional personnel." None of the options were particularly appealing. Transfer would mean starting over again, building new cover stories and hoping to avoid similar incidents. Returning to active duty would mean diving back into the high-stress world she was still recovering from. Staying at Pensacola would mean living with constant scrutiny and the security risks that came with blown operational cover. Thompson seemed to read her thoughts. "There's also the issue of Commander Vale. His behavior toward you constitutes assault on a fellow officer, which normally would result in court-martial proceedings. But prosecuting him would require revealing details about your background that could compromise ongoing operations. Elena understood immediately. A court-martial would mean testimony, evidence, and official records that would make her real assignment a matter of public record. The carefully constructed operational security that protected not just her, but everyone she'd served with, would be destroyed to pursue justice for Vale's relatively minor offenses. However, Morrison continued, Vale's actions have created other problems beyond the immediate security issues. His public confrontations with you have made him a liability to this command. Word of what happened is spreading through the entire base, and his credibility as an officer has been severely damaged. Elena remained silent, understanding that she was being briefed on a situation rather than asked for input. The decisions about her future would be made at levels far above her pay grade. Regardless of her preferences, Kowalski pulled up another screen on his tablet. We've been monitoring communication patterns since the incident. Increased phone calls to friends at other commands, internet searches for information about special operations assignments, attempts to access classified databases. Your cover isn't just blown, it's actively being investigated by people who don't have clearance for the information they're looking for. The implications were sobering. Elena's presence had inadvertently created a security breach that was spreading beyond Naval Station Pensacola. Curious personnel were asking questions that could potentially expose not just her own background, but the operational details of ongoing special operations missions. Thompson closed his tablet and looked directly at Elena. The decision has been made to extract you from this assignment. The question is where you go next, and that depends partly on your current psychological readiness for operational duty. Elena had been dreading this conversation for weeks. Her assignment to Pensacola had been as much about psychological recovery as physical healing. The mission that had ended her previous deployment had left scars that went deeper than the visible mark on her face. She'd lost teammates, watched good people die, and carried survivor's guilt that made sleep difficult and trust even harder. Sir, she said carefully, I'm not sure I'm ready for full operational status. Morrison nodded, his expression understanding rather than disappointed. That's an honest assessment, and it's appreciated. But the reality is that your presence here has become untenable. We need to find you an assignment that accommodates your recovery needs while addressing the security issues you've inadvertently created. The conversation continued for another hour, covering options and implications that would reshape Elena's immediate future. But the core truth was already clear. Her attempt at anonymous recovery had failed, and the consequences would follow her wherever she went next. As the meeting concluded and Elena prepared to leave, she reflected on the irony of her situation. Commander Vale's ignorant aggression had destroyed the very anonymity she'd been trying to protect, forcing her back into the spotlight she'd been seeking to escape. Outside Morrison's office, the base continued its daily routines, but Elena knew that everything had changed. The careful fiction of her administrative assignment was over, and whatever came next would require her to confront the realities she'd been hoping to avoid. The only certainty was that Commander Vale's attempts to humiliate her had achieved exactly the opposite of his intentions, exposing her as someone far more dangerous and valuable than he'd ever imagined possible. The revelation came 24 hours later in the most unexpected way possible. Elena was conducting routine equipment inventory in the training facility when an emergency alarm pierced the afternoon quiet. The base-wide announcement crackled through speakers with urgent authority. Medical emergency. Building 447. All available medical personnel respond immediately. Building 447 housed the Advanced Diving Training Tank, where Navy personnel practiced underwater operations in controlled conditions. Elena's training kicked in automatically. Years of emergency response had conditioned her to move toward crisis rather than away from it. She dropped her clipboard and ran toward the building, her administrative assignment temporarily forgotten in the face of immediate need. She arrived at the scene to find chaos. A training exercise had gone catastrophically wrong when a mechanical failure caused the diving tank's drainage system to malfunction. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Webb was trapped 15 feet underwater, unconscious and tangled in safety lines that had become a death trap when the tank's circulation pumps had reversed flow unexpectedly. Base medical personnel were on scene, but they faced an impossible situation. The tank's emergency drainage system was offline. The water pressure made normal rescue attempts dangerous, and Webb was rapidly running out of time. The diving supervisor, Chief Petty Officer Anderson, was coordinating rescue efforts while trying to prevent a training accident from becoming a fatality. "He's been down for 3 minutes," Anderson reported to the arriving emergency team. "Safety divers can't get close enough. The pump reversal created a current that's pulling them away from him. We're trying to manually override the system, but it's going to take too long." Elena assessed the situation in seconds. Webb was trapped in a position that required someone to approach from below, moving against the artificial current created by the malfunctioning pumps. It was technically possible, but it required diving skills far beyond what most Navy personnel possessed. It required someone trained in combat diving, who could operate effectively in hostile underwater environments, without hesitation. Elena stepped forward. "Chief, I can get him." Anderson looked at her with barely concealed frustration. "Rodriguez, this isn't administrative work. We need qualified rescue divers, not chief," Elena interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that cut through his protests. "I am qualified. Let me help him." Something in her tone made Anderson pause. The absolute confidence, the lack of uncertainty or bravado. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. But before he could respond, Elena was already stripping off her uniform shirt and kicking off her boots. "What's your dive qualification level?" Anderson demanded. Elena's response stopped all conversation in its tracks. "Master diver, combat swimmer, underwater demolition specialist." She rattled off certifications that represented the highest levels of military diving expertise. Qualifications that took years to earn and were held by fewer than 100 personnel in the entire Navy. The emergency team stared at her in shock. Elena Rodriguez, the quiet administrative specialist who'd been flying under the radar for weeks, had just claimed diving qualifications that exceeded those of most rescue specialists. But there was no time for verification or doubt. Webb's life hung in the balance. Elena grabbed diving gear from the emergency cache, her movements revealing familiarity with equipment that went far beyond basic training. She assembled a rebreather system with the fluid expertise of someone who'd done it countless times in high-stress situations, checked gas mixtures with automatic precision, and tested communication equipment with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned that equipment failure could mean death. "I'm going in," she announced, slipping into the tank without waiting for official permission. "Keep the communication channel open." What followed was a masterclass in technical diving that left the assembled emergency personnel speechless. Elena descended into the turbulent water with the controlled grace of someone completely at home in an environment that would terrify most people. The artificial current that had defeated previous rescue attempts seemed to barely affect her. As she moved through the water with purposeful efficiency, she reached Webb's position in less than a minute. Her approach calculated to use the pump's flow patterns rather than fight against them. The safety lines that had trapped him were tangled in a complex knot that required precise cutting in zero visibility conditions. Elena's training took over, her hands working by feel alone, to free him while maintaining perfect buoyancy. Control in the chaotic water. Conditions. The surface team watched through underwater cameras as Elena performed what amounted to a textbook combat rescue. She freed Webb from his entanglement, secured him with a rescue harness, and began the ascent with the careful attention to decompression protocols that marked her as someone who understood the deadly serious nature of diving emergencies. When she broke the surface, with Webb's unconscious form, the emergency team was ready. Medical personnel immediately began resuscitation efforts while Elena efficiently shed her diving gear and stepped back to let them work. Webb began breathing on his own within minutes, his vital signs stabilizing as the medical team prepared him for transport to the base hospital. Chief Anderson approached Elena as the ambulance pulled away, his expression a mixture of gratitude and profound confusion. "Rodriguez, where the hell did you learn to dive like that?" "That was combat swimmer-level technique." Elena's response was characteristically minimal. "Previous assignment, Chief." But Anderson wasn't satisfied with vague answers anymore. "Previous assignment where?" "That was special operations-level diving. You performed a rescue that would challenge most of our dive team specialists." His voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 20 years around military divers and knew exactly what he'd witnessed. The crowd of emergency responders had grown during the rescue, and Elena realized she was surrounded by personnel who just watched her demonstrate capabilities that completely contradicted her supposed administrative background. The careful anonymity she'd been trying to preserve was not just blown, it was obliterated by her own actions in saving a life. Commander Vale, who had arrived during the emergency response, stood at the edge of the crowd with an expression of dawning horror. He was finally beginning to understand the true magnitude of his mistake in targeting Elena. The woman he'd tried to humiliate wasn't just administratively assigned, she was someone with qualifications that exceeded most of the base's specialized personnel. Senior Chief Santos pushed through the crowd, her expression grim with understanding. "Rodriguez, we need to talk, now." Elena nodded, knowing that any pretense of maintaining her cover was now impossible. The rescue had been necessary to save Webb's life, but it had also revealed skills that could only come from the most elite levels of military training. Questions would be asked that couldn't be deflected with vague responses about previous assignments. As the crowd began to disperse, Elena caught sight of two familiar figures observing from the administrative building. Commander Thompson and Master Chief Kowalski had witnessed the entire rescue operation, and their presence meant that her superiors now had definitive proof that her operational capabilities remained intact despite her psychological struggles. The conversation she dreaded was about to become unavoidable. Her attempts at anonymous recovery were over, ended by the same instincts that had made her an elite operator in the first place: the inability to stand by when lives were at stake. Webb would survive because of her intervention, but Elena's carefully constructed new life was about to be swept away by the consequences of doing what she'd been trained to do. Emergency response had barely concluded when Captain Morrison received the call he'd been expecting. Commander Thompson's voice carried the weight of inevitability as he delivered the message that would change everything for Elena Rodriguez. "It's time," Thompson said simply. "After what just happened, there's no point in maintaining the fiction anymore. We need her back." Morrison understood immediately. Elena's rescue of Petty Officer Webb had been witnessed by too many people, demonstrated skills too advanced to explain away, and attracted attention from personnel who would inevitably start asking questions that couldn't be answered without revealing classified information. Her cover wasn't just blown, it was spectacularly, undeniably destroyed. Within an hour, Elena found herself once again in Morrison's office, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. The pretense of her administrative assignment was gone, replaced by the clinical efficiency of military personnel making operational decisions. Thompson and Kowalski were present again, along with a third individual Elena recognized immediately, Captain Rebecca Shaw. the commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Shaw's presence changed everything. She didn't make casual visits to administrative bases, didn't involve herself in routine personnel matters, and didn't waste time on anything that wasn't directly related to special operations. Her being at Pensacola meant that Elena's situation had escalated to the highest levels of Navy Special Operations Command. "Elena," Shaw began, dispensing with formalities entirely. "Your performance during today's emergency has resolved several questions we've been grappling with regarding your readiness for return to active duty." Elena remained at attention, but her mind was racing. The rescue had been instinctive, driven by training and moral obligation, rather than any desire to demonstrate her capabilities. But she understood that her actions had effectively ended her recovery, period, and forced decisions that might not align with her own assessment of her psychological readiness. Shaw continued, her tone professional but not unsympathetic. "Your diving skills remain at operational level. Your decision-making under pressure is sound. Your technical execution was flawless. From a purely tactical standpoint, you're ready to return to full duty." The qualification in her words was obvious. Technical readiness was different from psychological readiness, and everyone in the room understood the distinction. Elena had saved a life today, but that didn't necessarily mean she was prepared to return to the high-stress environment of special operations, where lives hung in the balance daily. Thompson pulled out a secure tablet and began scrolling through what Elena recognized as recent intelligence reports. "We have a situation that requires someone with your specific skill set," he said, his tone carrying the weight of classified information. "Maritime interdiction operation in the Eastern Mediterranean. High-value target, time-sensitive intelligence, and environmental conditions that require someone with advanced diving qualifications." Elena felt her stomach tighten. She recognized the careful language of mission briefings, the way critical details were presented as technical requirements rather than life-or-death scenarios. The Eastern Mediterranean meant hostile waters, potentially hostile forces, and the kind of operation where mistakes had permanent consequences. "Sir," Elena said carefully, "I'm not certain I'm psychologically ready for that level of operational stress." Shaw's expression softened slightly, revealing genuine concern beneath her professional demeanor. "Elena, I've read the full psychiatric evaluation from your last mission. I understand your concerns about returning to active duty. But I also know that sometimes the best therapy for operators like you is getting back to doing what you do best." The psychology of special operations recovery was complex and controversial. Some operators healed best through gradual reintegration into normal military life, while others struggled with the disconnect between their capabilities and their mundane assignments. Elena had been experiencing both approaches simultaneously, the official recovery program and her own internal struggle with purpose and identity. Kowalski leaned forward in his chair. "The mission parameters are structured to ease you back into operational status. You'd be working with a full team, including psychological support personnel. No solo operations, constant communication, and immediate extraction available if you experience any difficulty." Elena understood that they were offering her a carefully controlled return to the world she'd left behind. But she also knew that once she accepted active operational assignment, there would be no going back to the quiet anonymity she'd been trying to build at Pensacola. Morrison spoke for the first time since the briefing began. "Elena, there's another factor you need to consider. Your presence here has created security complications that go beyond your personal situation. Commander Vale's behavior has generated a tension that threatens operational security for ongoing missions." The implication was clear. Elena's blown cover wasn't just her problem. It was a liability that affected other operations and other personnel. Her choice wasn't simply between recovery and return to duty. It was between accepting active assignment or potentially compromising the Security of ongoing special operations. Shaw stood and moved to the window overlooking Pensacola Bay. I won't lie to you, Elena. We need operators with your qualifications for missions that are critical to national security. But more than that, we need you to make a decision about your future before the speculation about your background creates larger problems. Elena stared at the secure tablet displaying mission parameters that looked both familiar and terrifying. The technical requirements matched her qualifications perfectly, but the psychological demands represented exactly the kind of high-stress environment she'd been trying to escape. What about Commander Vale? Elena asked, recognizing that his behavior had been the catalyst for her current situation. Thompson's expression hardened. Commander Vale is being reassigned to a position where his lack of judgment won't endanger personnel or operations. His conduct toward you was unacceptable regardless of your background, but given your actual qualifications, his behavior constituted assault on a critical national security asset. The description of her as a critical national security asset carried implications that went beyond personal recognition. Elena understood that her value to the Navy extended far beyond her individual capabilities. She represented years of training, operational experience, and specialized knowledge that couldn't be easily replaced. Shaw turned back to face her. Elena, I need an answer within 24 hours. The mission window is closing, and we need to know whether you're available for assignment. Elena nodded, understanding that she was being given time to make a decision that would determine not just her immediate future, but the trajectory of her entire military career. The quiet recovery she'd been seeking was no longer an option, destroyed by the very instincts that had made her valuable in the first place. As the meeting concluded and the senior officers prepared to leave, Elena realized that Commander Vale's attempts to humiliate her had achieved something he'd never intended, forcing her to confront the question of whether she was ready to return to the world she'd been trained for, or if she truly needed more time to heal from wounds that went deeper than scars. The next 24 hours would determine whether Elena Rodriguez remained hidden in administrative anonymity or returned to the shadows where the Navy's most dangerous missions were planned and executed. Irony wasn't lost on her that a man's ignorant prejudice had inadvertently forced her to confront the most important decision of her military career. Elena's decision came at 0347 hours, delivered in a way that surprised everyone involved. Instead of requesting a formal meeting or submitting written response through official channels, she simply appeared at Captain Morrison's quarters, fully dressed in her administrative uniform, carrying a sealed envelope that contained her answer. Morrison, roused from sleep by his aide's urgent call, found Elena standing at attention in his office, her expression carrying the kind of calm determination he'd learned to associate with operators who'd made difficult but necessary choices. Sir, Elena said without preamble, I accept the assignment. Morrison took the envelope but didn't open it immediately. Something in Elena's demeanor suggested that her decision involved more than simple acceptance of return to active duty. Elena, are you certain you're ready for this? Her response revealed the depth of consideration she'd given to the choice. Sir, I've spent the last 3 months trying to convince myself that I could build a different life, that I could find peace in routine administrative work and normal military assignments. But the events of the past week have shown me that I can't escape what I am. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. The rescue yesterday wasn't a conscious decision to reveal my background. It was instinct. When I saw someone in danger, I responded the way my training dictated, regardless of the consequences for my cover. That tells me something important about my psychological state. Morrison opened the envelope and found not just her acceptance of assignment, but a detailed psychological self-assessment that demonstrated remarkable insight into her own mental condition. Elena had spent the night conducting the kind of honest self-evaluation that most operators avoided, confronting both her capabilities and her limitations with clinical precision. "I'm not completely healed," Elena continued, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "The nightmares haven't stopped. I still have trouble trusting new team members. Loud noises make me reach for weapons that aren't there. But I've realized that healing doesn't necessarily mean returning to who I was before. It might mean accepting who I am now and finding ways to be effective despite the damage." Morrison read through her self-assessment, noting the brutal honesty with which she'd evaluated her psychological readiness. Elena had identified specific triggers, developed coping strategies, and created protocols for recognizing when her stress levels might compromise mission effectiveness. It was the work of someone who understood both her value and her vulnerabilities. "There's another factor," Elena said, her tone shifting slightly. "Commander Vale's behavior has taught me something about the cost of hiding. For 3 months, I've been trying to blend in, to be invisible, to avoid drawing attention to what I can do. But that approach has its own dangers." She gestured toward the window overlooking the base. "There are good people here who could benefit from proper training, who could be more effective if they understood what real preparedness looks like. By hiding my capabilities, I've been denying them opportunities to learn and grow." Morrison understood immediately. Elena wasn't just accepting return to active special operations. She was proposing a hybrid assignment that would allow her to contribute to both elite missions and the development of conventional personnel. It was an innovative approach that could address multiple needs simultaneously. "You're suggesting a dual role," Morrison observed. "Yes, sir. Operational assignments when my specific skills are required, but also opportunities to train and develop other personnel when I'm between missions. It gives me purpose without the constant high-stress environment that might trigger psychological complications." The proposal was elegant in its practicality. Elena would remain available for critical missions while also contributing to the broader mission of military readiness. Her experience could be leveraged to improve training programs and develop capabilities in other personnel, creating value beyond her individual operational effectiveness. Morrison reached for his secure phone. "I need to brief Captain Shaw on your decision and proposal. This kind of dual assignment would require approval at levels above my authority." Elena nodded, understanding that her suggestion represented a departure from standard special operations career paths. But she also knew that her situation was unique enough to justify unconventional approaches. The conversation with Shaw was brief but decisive. Within an hour, Elena had preliminary approval for her proposed assignment structure, pending final review by Naval Special Warfare Command. Her return to active duty would be gradual, beginning with training responsibilities and consultation on mission planning before progressing to full operational status. As dawn broke over Pensacola Bay, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in months: clarity about her future. The decision to return to active duty hadn't been easy, but it felt right in a way that her attempts at administrative anonymity never had. Commander Vale, meanwhile, was receiving his own life-changing news. His reassignment orders had arrived during the night, transferring him to a desk job in Washington, D.C., where his interactions with operational personnel would be minimal and his capacity for causing damage severely limited. Vale's final encounter with Elena occurred in the administrative building, where he encountered her reviewing mission files that clearly exceeded her supposed clearance level. The sight of her working with classified materials that confirmed her special operations background was the final piece of evidence that his behavior had been directed at someone far more dangerous and valuable than he'd ever imagined. "Rodriguez," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of its previous arrogance. Elena looked up from her files, her expression neutral but not hostile. "Sir, I owe you an apology," Vale said, the words coming out stiff and uncomfortable. "I was wrong about who you are, what you've done, and what you're capable of." My behavior was unacceptable regardless, but knowing your real background makes it inexcusable. Elena's response was characteristic in its professionalism. Sir, we all make mistakes. The measure of our character is how we learn from them. Vale nodded, understanding that her forgiveness was more generous than he deserved. As he walked away to begin his own involuntary transition to a very different military career, he reflected on the cost of his prejudice and ignorance. Elena returned to her files, already beginning the process of transitioning back to the world she'd tried to leave behind. The quiet recovery period was over, but she was returning to active duty with a clearer understanding of her own capabilities and limitations. The events set in motion by Commander Vale's ignorant aggression had ultimately forced Elena to confront truths about herself that months of therapy and administrative work hadn't addressed. Sometimes healing required returning to the source of trauma, not running from it. As she prepared for her first mission briefing in 3 months, Elena touched the scar on her face and smiled slightly. The mark would always remind her of loss and sacrifice, but it would also remind her of survival and purpose. She was Elena Rodriguez, decorated Special Operations veteran, and she was ready to return to work. 6 months later, the transformation of Naval Station Pensacola's training programs had become the subject of quiet admiration throughout the Navy's special warfare community. Elena Rodriguez had returned from her first operational assignment, a successful maritime interdiction mission in the Eastern Mediterranean, and immediately threw herself into revolutionizing how the base approached combat training and mental resilience preparation. The changes were subtle but profound. Elena had established what she called integrated readiness protocols that combined advanced physical techniques with psychological preparation methods drawn from her special operations experience. The training wasn't just about teaching sailors to fight. It was about teaching them to think, adapt, and maintain composure under extreme stress. The old combatives facility had been redesigned to incorporate scenario-based training that reflected real-world conditions rather than sterile gymnasium exercises. Elena had convinced base leadership to install modular training environments that could simulate everything from ship corridors to urban combat zones, allowing personnel to practice techniques in contexts that matched their likely operational requirements. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture of the training itself. Elena had eliminated the toxic masculinity and ego-driven competition that had characterized previous programs, replacing them with collaborative learning environments where strength was measured by the ability to elevate others rather than dominate them. Petty Officer Marcus Vale, whose rescue had catalyzed Elena's return to prominence, had become one of her most dedicated students. His near-death experience had given him profound appreciation for competence over bravado, and he'd thrown himself into Elena's training programs with the intensity of someone who understood that skills could mean the difference between life and death. Chief Rodriguez changed everything about how we think about preparation, Webb explained to a visiting delegation from Naval Special Warfare Command. The promotion had come with Elena's official recognition as a training specialist, acknowledging her dual role as operational asset and educational innovator. "It's not about being the toughest person in the room," Webb continued, demonstrating a technique Elena had taught him for controlling breathing under stress. "It's about being the most prepared, the most aware, and the most capable of helping others when things go wrong." The visiting officers observed training sessions that bore little resemblance to traditional military combatives. Elena had integrated meditation techniques, stress inoculation protocols, and collaborative problem-solving exercises that prepared personnel for the psychological demands of combat as thoroughly as the physical requirements. Commander Sarah Chun, who had replaced Vale as the senior training officer, watched Elena conduct a session on controlled aggression. teaching sailors how to access necessary violence while maintaining tactical thinking and moral reasoning. The instruction was surgical in its precision, addressing the psychological complexities of combat in ways that conventional training had never attempted. "She's created something entirely new," Chun observed to Captain Morrison. "It's not special operations training scaled down for conventional personnel. It's a completely different approach that bridges the gap between elite capabilities and general military readiness." Elena's methodology had attracted attention beyond Pensacola. Naval commands around the world were requesting her consultation on training programs, and her techniques were being studied for potential implementation across multiple services. The quiet administrative specialist who had arrived 6 months earlier seeking anonymity had become one of the Navy's most sought-after training innovators. But the true measure of Elena's impact was visible in the personnel she'd trained. The sailors who completed her programs carried themselves differently, more aware, more confident, more capable of functioning effectively under pressure. They demonstrated the kind of composure and tactical thinking that had once been the exclusive domain of elite special operations units. The transformation extended beyond individual capability to unit cohesion. Elena's emphasis on collaborative strength building had created teams that functioned with unprecedented coordination and mutual support. The competitive individualism that had characterized previous training cultures had been replaced by collective effectiveness that multiplied individual capabilities. As evening settled over Pensacola Bay, Elena stood in the renovated training facility, observing her students practice techniques that combined physical skill with mental discipline. The space hummed with focused energy as sailors worked through scenarios designed to challenge both their technical abilities and their psychological resilience. The scar on her face caught the LED lighting that had replaced the harsh fluorescence of the old facility. The mark no longer felt like a reminder of trauma. It had become a symbol of survival, growth, and the possibility of transformation even after profound damage. Elena's journey from broken operator to innovative leader had required confronting truths about trauma, healing, and the meaning of strength that she'd spent months avoiding. Commander Vale's ignorant aggression had inadvertently forced her to discover that recovery didn't mean returning to who she'd been before. It meant becoming someone new who could carry forward the best of her experience while leaving behind what no longer served. The whispers about Elena's background had never entirely stopped, but they'd evolved from speculation into respect. New personnel arriving at Pensacola were briefed about Chief Rodriguez not as a mysterious figure with a classified past, but as an exceptional leader whose methods had revolutionized military training. The legacy of that confrontation 6 months earlier lived on in the countless sailors who'd learned that true strength came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the capacity to elevate them. Elena's response to Vale's violence, measured, professional, and ultimately transformative, had become a teaching case about leadership under pressure. As the training session concluded and her students began securing equipment, Elena reflected on the unexpected path that had brought her to this moment. She'd sought anonymity and found purpose. She'd tried to hide her capabilities and discovered new ways to share them. She'd attempted to escape her past and instead had learned to transform it into something valuable for others. Commander Vale's attempt to humiliate her had ultimately created something far more significant than either of them could have imagined: a new model for military training that honored both strength and wisdom, both capability and character. The evening ocean breeze carried the sounds of a bass winding down for the night, but Elena's work continued. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, and new opportunities to prove that the most dangerous warriors were often those who chose restraint over aggression, teaching over domination, and growth over revenge. Chief Elena Rodriguez had found her place not by hiding from what she was, but by discovering what she could become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.